Hi. Thank you very much for inviting me, Stephanie, and thanks for inviting me along. Let's see if this will share. Yep. I offered to present this at the symposium because I thought it had some relevance to everyone here, because we've basically everyone collects egocentric data, and the UC data set also includes some negative ties as well. And so I thought what I want to do is present some work that myself and three other colleagues, Michael Jenkin, Raji Kanagaval, oh, good Lord, it's moving forward, Raji Kanagaval and Janice Yap at Singapore Management University have been working on. I'll start with a simple question. When you look at these name generators, which ones of these do you think are basically overlapping and asking the same question, and which ones are actually giving unique alters? I'm just going to hide the video. And ask you, which ones do you think are giving, I'm so sorry, unique alters? It's a really difficult problem, and basically there's a challenge in network analysis that we have a huge plethora of name generators, but it's not really clear which ones are basically asking the same things and which ones are asking the same things, and which ones are really generating unique and useful new alters. So yeah, as we are, like, it's true that not all positive and negative ties are the same. They don't all have the same meaning or the same dynamics, but there aren't as many types or dimensions as there are name generators in the literature. So there's some sort of need to systematically identify a topology of sign ties. And by sign ties here, we simply mean positive and negative ties. This paper will briefly introduce two research questions. I'll answer two research questions. One is, in study one, we look at what are the fundamental types of positive and negative ties. And the second one, we look at what are the predictors and outcomes, what predictors and outcomes systematically differ. And I guess the argument is, as I've said, partly there's just redundancy. We shouldn't be asking, we ideally shouldn't be asking ties. Asking name generators is very burdensome on respondents, so we don't want to ask too many of them, but we also don't want to bias our data by missing key actors. And the other thing is that, in a sense, categories are the first step towards theory, so having the correct categories makes a big difference. Within the literature on classification, there are two broad approaches. Just to step back for a brief literature review, there's approaches which use what we call a typology. So you can think of things like the strong tie, weak ties is a typology. It's a conceptual distinction that starts in the realm of ideas and then moves on to classify the world. The other approach that we can use is, actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to exit out of this, because if I do it this way, I will actually not have it cycling forward on me. Is that okay? Yeah. It won't cycle forward on me. So we have, and the other approach is a taxonomy approach, and that's where we take real data and we look for differences that emerge based on empirical distinctions. So thinking of factor analysis, principal component analysis are classic ways to do it, but also just classification of things like species and so forth in other sciences. Within the network literature, there is various different typologies, quite a lot of them. Just to mention a few of them, the social support literature draws distinctions between emotional and affective, instrumental, informational, companionship. There's also a recent paper on negative ties by Joe LaBianca's research group, and they talk about the difference between affective ties, cognitive ties, and behavioral ties, which are simply which are defined by exactly what the tie is. There are some work on taxonomies, though quite limited, that we can find in the literature. There's a paper on advice, friendship, and support, and another paper, which identifies these 3 dimensions. There's another more recent paper which we use as to inform our methodology, which is that of Voris and Snyder's, and it identifies 3 types, and the types are positive ties, negative ties, and role relations. So it's, you know, we will argue, I guess, that they're still very broad categories. So the first study, very briefly, it's a mechanical Turk study. We did a 5 to 10 minute survey. We used 6 name generators. Each person got 6 name generators from a pool of 24. Those 24 I showed you at the beginning, which were largely selected from literature, and we got nearly 1,500 respondents. The idea was, by randomizing giving different name generators to each respondent, we actually managed to make sure that every pair of name generators had 50 respondents, and so could construct a matrix of the overlap between each of the name generators in terms of the alters they generated. So these are our questions, and I can tell you what the exact wording is if you'd like to see. I've got it in the appendix and also the papers they come from. This is the research design. Not that interesting, but basically about 50 respondents or more got each one of these colored squares. And across the top here, we have the 24 name generators and the 24 name generators down the side. So effectively, we had a whole lot of small sort of experimental groups who got different name generators. And this was just to avoid the problem of respondent burden. And therefore either lower quality research. It was a Qualtrics survey, randomized order of the 6 networks in each condition. We randomized those so that we didn't get any order effects. Each question was allowed answers of up to 10 new alters, and then alters from the previous questions were piped through to the next question. So in the end, people could give up to 60 alters if they wanted. After the 6 questions, we then actually represented everyone with all the names and all the ties as a matrix, and then asked them to actually, without giving them what the information they'd given to us before, we asked them to actually refill it all out. And that we think it will have reduced the ordering effects. And we also asked about ego and alter attributes. So in this one, there's nearly a bit over 8,000 alters. I will jump through to the analysis. You can see we got a very big diversity in terms of roles of alters. So spouses, parents, acquaintances, friends. This big friends category is huge, obviously. So what did we find? The method we went through was 4 steps. It was constructing a conditional probability matrix, and then doing hierarchical clustering, then multidimensional scaling. And then we use Uden's J to identify which ties best captured each cluster. This is the conditional probability matrix. I won't dwell on it, but simply to say that we think it has a lot of advantages over something like Jacquard, for those who are interested, because it actually really shows when there's an overlap. The overlap can be very different, particularly between big groups and small groups of ties. So it turns out, for example, that 10% of the people who you socialize with are people who you classify as harming you, while of the people who harm you, you socialize with 70% of those on average. And most measures that are used in this literature just do an intersect. So this is the hierarchical clustering. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, and it found broadly 3 clusters of positive ties and 3 clusters of negative ties. We then moved on to do a multidimensional scaling. It's a metric multidimensional scaling, and I've visualized the clusters here. We've actually done supplementary analysis with non-metric MDS and also PCA, and shows similar results. And we also used discrete parallel analysis, and they both show that a 2-dimension solution is optimal. So what does this 2-dimension solution look like? We basically have, we have a dimension that goes from negative to positive, and that's most of the variation. That's a lot of what's going on. So that is the best approximation, a really simple 1-dimensional approximation. And then we have this other dimension. To be honest, we're still struggling to exactly classify it, but we call it a social distance. in a sense that people you're socializing with and you're actively have active conflict with, you tend to actually have a lot more interactions with, whereas people who you experience things like contempt or admiration, you have much less. So just very briefly, we came up with the dimension reduction identified 3 positive and 3 negative. To briefly go through them, so we found one which was dislike and look down, which we called contempt. We had another one that was made up of avoiding, not sharing, not relying on, harming you, which we called passive conflict. Another one called active conflict, which is disagree, demanding, who makes you angry. And then in the positive ties, we had socialize, which was off on its own. And then almost all of the name generators of the positive ties all kind of clustered together in a dimension reduction. I think you've got 8 of them here or 9 of them here, which we called closeness. And then lastly, we got about three of them forming around a group we called admiration. But it's basically a status issue, status dimension here. And I think it is quite interesting on both the positive and negative ties, you have this status dimension, which it turns out is the most distant from the other from the ties of the opposite sign. Like there's almost no overlap between contempt and any of these positive ties. There's almost no overlap between admiration and any of these negative ties. So moving along, I'm actually gonna do this just give you the final answer. We looked at saying what ties would best operationalize each one of those, because as researchers who use this classification could only pick one name generator, that's the point, it's supposed to save time. So we used a method called Uden's J statistic, or informedness, or book maker informedness, which maximizes the trade-off between sensitivity and specificity, so true positives and true negatives. This is what we found. We found basically a decent operationalization for each, or the best operationalization, which we'll talk about later. How long do I have, Stephanie? Can I just ask? I meant to start a timer and I didn't.
Yeah, no problem. If you could maybe wrap up in about 2 to 3 more minutes.
Yeah, that's what I've got. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so very briefly, we did a second study then using those 6 name generators that we identified as having the highest, the sort of best trade-off between false positive and false negative, or true positive and true negative, and looked at the relationship between those, and it is cross-sectional, between what you might think of as predictors and outcomes of these ties. So we looked at things like emotions, sources of social support, who influences you, who's you're interdependent with, and also predictors like the alters role, ego attributes, alter attributes, strength of ties. So these are all multi-level logistic regression models with random effects for egos. The reports have got odds ratios. They aren't the full models generally because you wouldn't be able to see them. Probably the most interesting one, maybe I could just stop after this, is with negative ties, we found a really nice correlation with and distinction around 3 different sort of emotional categories. So active conflict, which the operationalization was who makes you angry, but it was angry and sad. Passive conflict, it was afraid and guilty. And contempt, it was disgust and loathing. This is probably the most clearest and most distinct of all of the findings. Briefly looking at positive emotions, there was some differentiation, but they weren't as strongly differentiated. The different types of ties, it really just went positive, negative. With social support, we found that closeness and admiration tend to be associated with comforting when you're grieving the death of a close person in your life, and also financial problems, which I think seem to be more serious types of problems, while socialize is more associated with, companionship on a day trip, as you would expect. The other outcomes, Closeness and admiration are associated with people who influence you. Interestingly, and this was not what we expected, but contempt is associated with people you're interdependent with. And, you know, active conflict causes you the most distress, or people who cause you the most distress. Yeah. In terms of predictors, I think one of the most interesting is simply this active conflict really is actually people you've got a lot of positive ties with, like spouses, parents, siblings, and you have actually quite a lot of frequent contact with. So this has quite a lot of overlap with positive ties. Yes, and I might just leave it there, but just say we want to, in the future, we'd like to replicate and check these analysis. That's my alarm. And using other dimension reduction techniques, larger data sets, more name generators and attributes. Also looking at a wider variety of predictors and consequences, because clearly almost any network study that has used any of these questions could actually use a more complex conception of name generators. And also thinking about typologies for non-personal networks such as states. Thank you.